The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
I was the fastest girl in America.
Mary Cain, there are women here almost twice her age, being left in her wake.
I set many national records, and I was a straight A student. When I was 16, I got a call from Alberto Salazar at Nike. He was the world's most famous track coach, and he told me I was the most talented athlete he'd ever seen. During my freshman year in college, I moved out to train with him and his team full-time at Nike World Headquarters. It was a team of the fastest athletes in the world, and it was a dream come true. I joined Nike because I wanted to be the best female athlete ever. Instead, I was emotionally and physically abused by a system designed by Alberto and endorsed by Nike. This is what happened to me. When I first arrived, an all-male Nike staff became convinced that in order for me to get better, I had to become thinner and thinner and thinner. This Nike team was the top running program in the country. And yet we had no certified sports psychologist, there was no certified nutritionist. It was really just a bunch of people who were Alberto's friends. So when I went to anybody for help, they would always just tell me the same thing, and that was to listen to Alberto. Alberto was constantly trying to get me to lose weight. He created an arbitrary number of 114 pounds, and he would usually weigh me in front of my teammates and publicly shame me if I wasn't hitting weight. He wanted to give me birth control pills and diuretics to lose weight, the latter of which isn't allowed in track and field. I ran terrible during this time. It reached a point where I was on the starting line and I'd lost the race before I started, because in my head, all I was thinking of was not the time I was trying to hit, but the number on the scale I saw earlier that day. It would be naive to not acknowledge the fact that weight is important in sports. It's like boxers need to maintain a certain weight, or, everybody always ends up citing the math about how the thinner you are, the faster you're going to run because you have to carry less weight. But here's a biology lesson I learned the hard way. When young women are forced to push themselves beyond what they're capable at their given age, they're at risk for developing REDS. Suddenly, you realize you've lost your period for a couple months. And then a couple months becomes a couple years. And in my case, it was a total of 3. And if you're not getting your period, you're not going to be able to have the necessary levels of estrogen to maintain strong bone health. And in my case, I broke 5 different bones. The New York Times Magazine published a story about how Alberto was training me and nurturing my talent. We weren't doing any of that. I felt so scared, I felt so alone, and I felt so trapped. And I started to have suicidal thoughts. I started to cut myself. Some people saw me cutting myself. And, nobody really did anything or said anything. So in 2015, I ran this race, and I didn't run super well. And afterwards, there was a thunderstorm going on. Half the track was under one tent. Alberto yelled at me in front of everybody else at the meet. And he told me that I clearly gained 5 pounds before the race. It was also that night that I told Alberto and our sports psych that I was cutting myself, and they pretty much told me they just wanted to go to bed. And I think for me, that was my kick in the head where I was like, this system is sick. I think even for my parents in certain ways, once I finally vocalized to them, they were horrified. They bought me the first plane ride home, and they were like, get on that flight, get the hell out of there. I wasn't even trying to make the Olympics anymore. I was just trying to survive. So I made the painful choice and I quit the team.
After a multi-year investigation, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency has banned Alberto Salazar from the sport for 4 years.
Nike will shut down the Oregon project.
Nike CEO Mark Parker stepping down from the company in January of 2020.
Those reforms are mostly a direct result of the doping scandal. They're not acknowledging the fact that there's a systemic crisis in women's sports and at Nike, in which young girls' bodies are being ruined by an emotionally and physically abusive system. That's what needs to change.
That was the runner Mary Cain speaking words from her New York Times op-ed last month. Since her story, there were several other current and former female elite runners that have spoken out with similar concerns about the now defunct Nike Oregon project and also elsewhere. Mary Cain's account and the other athletes' account of the treatments by the Nike Oregon project are absolutely horrifying and unethical, and I personally call upon all coaches to speak out about this topic and increase awareness around the issue. We need to protect our female athletes and have empathy for them and all athletes, really. And we need to be a part of the solution to make sure the athletes have robust support in the training and coaching process. This is a very serious topic, and not just to elite athletes. There's a conversation that can be had with athletes all along the spectrum, from recreational to pro, and also with the coaches that work with them. And so for the coaches that train and coach these athletes for competition, and I certainly fall into that category, most people know this, for the better part of a decade, I've worked to build out a training and coaching platform for endurance athletes. So I understand the delicate navigation around having to not only drive results for athletes, but also in the process, provide good, healthy, science and evidence-based thought leadership and training and coaching approaches and guidance around nutrition and body composition for these events. So what's the coach's role here? Where's the line at? When does the coach punt? When and how does the coach seek help? How do you build out a robust solution for your platform? And what's your coach mentoring process going to be like, etc.? So there's much to unpack from the coaching side, but also there is the issue from the athlete side, where we have endurance athletes, the weekend warriors that are driven by desires to perform, hit those personal records, the qualifiers, but also driven by social influence and sometimes obsessive need to compete with the social media galleries. And in so doing, sometimes athletes will drive themselves to behaviors that might not be the most effective way to institute their training. And what do you need to look out for so that you can, in a healthy way, achieve and pursue your athletic objectives in a safe and effective way? So there's much to touch on here. I'll have more to say in my afterword, but my thought was not to try to boil the ocean in one podcast. I want to have another podcast on this topic. For this first one, however, I want to just simply raise awareness about Red S, which was formerly known as the Female Triad. And my guest, Dr. Margo Mountjoy, is the authority on this topic. She's a member of the International Olympic Committee Medical Commission Games Group. And the reason why we now have the term Red S, or Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, is because the IOC convened an expert panel headed up by Dr. Mountjoy to update the 2005 IOC Consensus statement on the Female Triad. And the more recent consensus statement replaced the previous one and introduced the term Red S as a broader, more comprehensive explanation for the condition previously known as the Female Athlete Triad. She is a clinical scientist, and one of her areas of expertise is in the field of harassment and abuse in sport. She has also led a group of world leaders in researching and authoring another IOC consensus statement on harassment and abuse in sport. And so not only has she worked with the IOC, but she's also worked with the World Health Organization, the Association for Summer Olympic International Federations, FINA, which is the governing body of swimming, and she's also worked with UNICEF. She's a medical doctor, and she completed her medical degree and family medicine residency training at McMaster University. And she also has a PhD in sports medicine from Vrije University in the Netherlands. She has a diploma of sport medicine from the Canadian Academy of Sport and Exercise Medicine, and she's a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Mountjoy is also a former elite athlete herself, reaching the highest levels of sport in synchronized swimming, and works as the current physician for Artistic Swimming Canada. So I get Dr. Mountjoy's thoughts upon hearing the news that broke from Mary Cain about the Nike Oregon project. I talk with her about the origin of the work that went into the Female Triad and its underlying effects. We talk about her work with the IOC to broaden the Female Triad into what's now known as Red S, and we talk about the performance and health implications for athletes. We also get into the male athlete and how male athletes are affected and symptoms that they need to look out for. And we talk about the general return to play process and her advice to athletes and coaches. So, without further delay, I give you Dr. Margo Mountjoy. Dr. Margo Mountjoy, thanks for coming on to the podcast today.
My pleasure, Tony. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to chat about something very near and dear to my heart and something that I work on both from a scientific perspective and in my clinical practice.
Yes. All right. Well, to start, and before we dive into these important topics, I want to get the listeners to know you in your own words, and your history coming up as a young elite female athlete yourself, and some of the drivers that led this to making these issues your life's work.
So my background was a synchronous swimmer, which is now called artistic swimmer, and I functioned as an athlete at the elite level, traveling for Canada internationally and competing around the world.
Okay.
I was not at the Olympic level, because when I was a competitive athlete, artistic or synchronicity was not in the Olympic Games. And then when it started, it was only solo and duet, so very few athletes were able to attend. And certainly in my athletic career, I did see young women that were energy deficient through more likely food restriction and trying to meet a certain typical body image required in the sport rather than, in addition to extraneous exercise output of energy through the high demands of the sport. I always knew I wanted to be a physician, and obviously giving back to sport was something that was a passion of mine given my history in sport. So when I became a physician, I started immediately within my career in sport medicine, and I've been working in sport medicine at the University of Guelph at the Health and Performance Center for many years. And then that led to my work with national teams, Artistic Swimming Canada, for many years, and then working with Athletics Canada with the Endurance Sport Centre and some work with Triathlon Canada. So I worked with a lot of athletes that have energy deficiency from either food restriction, trying to meet a certain body type, and or extraneous excessive exercises with energy, high energy expenses through endurance sport. That led to my work eventually with FINA, which is an aquatic governing body, and then that led to my work on the IOC, or the International Olympic Committee.
I see. And so a lot of your work went directly into the thought leadership behind Red-S, and you worked with the committee to bring forth the written statement that outlines Red-S, and so that's the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you, given the fallout from the Nike Oregon project. And so many of our listeners are endurance athletes, and so when the fallout happened, I knew this would be an important podcast to do.
Yes, for sure. Now, certainly, like my work with the International Olympic Committee is, I work on the Games group, but also in between games, we do scientific projects depending on the need and also the expertise. So at one point, 2014, I was leading a group on rewriting the Female Athlete Triad. And when the group of experts got together in Lausanne at the IOC headquarters to discuss the topic and rewrite the topic, and that was our full intention, as we discussed the science around the table. After 2 days of full discussion of the science, it became obvious to all of us that there are many more body systems involved in the affected by low energy availability than just female hormonal cycles, as well as bone. So that was when we made a bold decision to say, look, the science has evolved since Barbara Drinkwater's pivotal work in the Triad in the 1980s, and since the American College of Sport Medicine rebranded the Triad in 2007, and the science has expanded enough that we do know that low energy availability affects male athletes, and we do know that more body systems are involved. Hence the development of the new syndrome, relative energy deficiency in sport, where low energy availability is the core cause of all the different body systems affected from a health perspective, and the performance implications as well. So this work, 2014-15, we did some more publications on it, and I've been actively involved in research projects and promotional projects with the International Olympic Committee and various other organizations since then.
I see. Now, and before we get into some of the details of Red-S, what were your thoughts when news broke of the fallout of the Nike Oregon project and some of the testimonies from some of the women who had various accounts of physical abuse and mental abuse?
Yeah, I must say that I was very saddened by what I read and reading of the athlete's experience, but at the same time I was absolutely not surprised. And I think that, is also sad in and of itself that I was not surprised. I work in elite sport. I have a clinic where I run, I have run REDS clinics where I see athletes that are suffering from energy deficiency. And, there's stories that I were hearing were unfortunately not uncommon. And then, the whole aspect of not just unconscious, energy deficiency from either overtraining or poor nutritional habits. It can be forced upon them through erroneous coaching and harassment type of coaching. And that, to me, opens another domain of it's not just something that, can happen by mistake. It actually can happen and be forced. And that is a form of physical abuse. Harassment and abuse in sport, unfortunately, is part of the underbelly of sport, and it's another area that I work in the IOC on the working group on the prevention of harassment and abuse in sport under the leadership of Prince Faisal of Jordan. And this is an active group that has also published on the area of harassment and abuse. So the Mary Cain story in the New York Times and the Nike Oregon project really struck two of the projects I work on very closely, both the REDS, the energy deficiency, as well as the implications. And again, I'm not part of the project, so I can't comment on it, but the implications in the news releases of potential harassment and or abuse of the athletes that were involved in this project.
Right. Yeah, it was very troubling. I mean, as a coach, it certainly represent just sort of a lack of care and empathy for the athletes. I mean, there were accounts of giving diuretics and birth control pills to lose weight, weighing athletes in front of other athletes and calling them out in front of other athletes for not, hitting certain...
Yes. Yeah, that's very sad, isn't it? I mean, is that the coach's ignorance of understanding the implications that has for young women? Is that just the way they were taught to do it? Is that the norm in the sport culture? But I think it's time to stop. May Mary Cain's experience and her testimony in the New York Times and other athletes have come forward since then. May they be the impetus for us to stop these erroneous coaching practices of body shaming, of really abusing women's bodies and men as well, frankly, in other sports, in causing them potential health deficits, mental health deficits, and as well as these behaviors which actually have a negative effect on performance. So it's time to stop, and I think in honor of the bravado or the bravery that Mary Cain and these other athletes have in coming forward, we owe it to them to pay attention to their story. And for those of us in positions of relative power where we can influence change, it's time for us to act.
I agree.
And it's time for us to do something, and thank you for this podcast, and may it be part of the cultural shift and change in this field.
Yeah.
Certainly, it was also a kind of a coincidence because I literally the day or two after Mary Cain's story came out, I was invited by a philanthropy group in Canada who supports sports initiatives in Canada, had invited a number of international experts to Montreal to discuss REDS and how we can act and develop cultural change within sport in Canada and hopefully outside of Canada to address this issue. So Mary Cain's story really was just coincidentally appropriate to our meeting. And in fact, we've written an editorial coming out of this meeting that will be hopefully published soon. And Mary Cain has graciously become a co-author on our editorial. And our editorial is focused on the cultural shift required in sport to stop these erroneous types of behaviors of coaches and raise awareness really in both athletes and coaches of the detriment these behaviors have on athletes' health and ultimately also on their performances.
Right, yes, and I was very surprised too, the Nike Oregon project was stood up as a sort of coaching think tank to to enhance the performance of American athletes primarily. This was back in 2001, but in looking at the entire operation, there was no robust partnerships with doctors, subject matter experts in nutrition, PhDs. It didn't seem like they had a robust partnership to really support those athletes. And I think that's something that your coaches and athletes can learn from that. And then, you always need to have those partnerships to be able to get expert help in those areas.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not well versed on the origins or history of the Nike Oregon project, so I can't comment on what they did or did not do. I certainly know from the types of behaviors and coach practices that I've learned through Mary Cain's story and others that there's room for improvement, shall we say?
Right.
And certainly, I challenge Nike. Here's an opportunity for you. If you really want to have the reputation of being one of the best in the business of elite running, an elite endurance runner, partner with sports science, partner with the experts. The group that I work with are very happy to partner with Nike to be part of the solution. Let's produce fast runners that remain healthy, uninjured, and perform faster. It's very possible to do it. We can do it with the science that exists. We can do it in males and females, and we can do it with success.
Right.
So I really take this opportunity. I hope that Nike takes this opportunity to learn from this situation and to create, working relationships and partners with sports science that can inform coaching practices to improve.
Reputable strategies, science and evidence-based approaches, and it can work. It can work.
Yes, and it does work, and we learn from, just the effect and power of sports science from the IAAF, so the Track and Field World Championships in Qatar recently this fall in the extreme heat. Most athletes did not have problems with extreme heat. The ones that were followed by sports scientists that would use science to acclimatize and to fuel themselves properly against dehydration and heat stroke, and many athletes did very well, and those were the ones that had sports science partnering with coaching. So there's an important role in sports science to inform coaches of best practice and evidence base to improve performance and protect health.
Right. Okay, so let's give our listeners an overview behind the origin. You talked a little bit about it, but the origin of the work that led to the Female Triad and its underlying core principles.
Yes, I did give a sneak peek earlier on. So this work is really based on the seminal work of Barbara Drinkwater in the 1980s, where she first coined the term Female Athlete Triad, where she discovered these young women, often elite long-distance runners, who were amenorrheic, so had no menstrual function at all, and who developed very thin bones and ultimately osteoporosis. And she thought the origin, or the other part of the triad, so the three parts were thin bones, amenorrhea, or lack of menstruation, and the third part, she said, was eating disorders. So certainly that support the three sides. In 2007, the American College of Sport Medicine I don't want to say rebranded, but with emerging science showed that it wasn't actually just an eating disorder. It could happen along the continuum of healthy eating practices, through eating disordered to disordered eating, and that the healthy menstruation through a continuum would gradually become amenorrheic, but it would go through a phase of oligomenorrhea, or abnormal menstruation, before the periods actually stopped, and that the bones started off as healthy bones, and with prolonged time of energy deficiency, they would become osteoporotic, but they'd go through a period of thinning before they became actually osteoporotic or super thin. So that triad was reconfigured in 2007 by the American College of Sport Medicine, and that was what was known as the Female Athlete Triad. And there's been a fair bit of science delineating the hormonal pathways affecting each other in these three different components. But what we do know is that the root cause of it is actually low energy availability. And I describe that as kind of like a bank account. You have what you put in and you have what you spend. So we spend energy through exercise. We spend energy through living, walking around, our heart beating, digesting our meals. So we have expenses of energy through just living and through exercise. So our athletes spend more through exercise than the average person. Now, the energy intake, like what we put in our bank account of energy, is what we eat. So food is fuel. So if we don't eat enough in athletes that energy restrict, we will have a relative energy deficiency. If we spend too much in athletes that over-exercise or endurance athletes that must exercise long, duration without balancing with appropriate energy replacement through intake, then we land up in a relative energy deficiency. So you can have low energy availability from either not eating enough or from spending too much energy. So in fact, many of my athletes do not have eating disorders or disordered eating. They actually just spend a lot of energy through their exercise and don't match it appropriately with energy intake because appetite alone is not sufficient in many cases to match the energy expenses of the exercise. Now, there are some, of course, with disordered eating or eating disorders, and that's a different problem to deal with. But certainly that's the sort of origins of that. I was tired of actually telling my male athletes for years that they had the Female Athlete Triad. And of course, these male athletes did not have menstrual problems, but they had male sex hormone related problems and they had thin bones. And I knew they were suffering from low energy availability, but at the time we didn't have a name to call it other than Female Athlete Triad. So when RED's relative energy deficiency in sport term came along, then it really expanded the opportunity to treat our male athletes with a similar problem. And the science since 2014, when this first paper came out, has exploded in the field of research on male athletes and the effects of low energy availability because it is different. The hormonal systems respond differently to low energy availability in men and women. And it's not surprising, men are not women, women are not men. And they do have different sensitivities to low energy availability and thresholds to changing their hormonal systems based on low energy availability. So it's really quite an exciting time in science because it's exploding with new knowledge as time goes on. Right. And we're finding that there's other sports involved, not just endurance or the athletic sports. I did a study in sprint power sports, and the hypothesis was that these athletes would not suffer from REDS, and we were wrong. These athletes can also suffer from REDS for various reasons. So there's an ongoing study in volleyball. There's there's lots of work in the field, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. So RED-S really extended beyond the female triad by really realizing that not only women were susceptible to it, and men were also a part of that, and it could be various implications, psychological, physiological as well. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's absolutely fair to say. So it's not just the gender that's different, it's also the number of body systems involved. Mm-hmm. So there are many more body systems that we know are affected. There's immunity, there's protein synthesis, there's metabolism, there's the GI system, there's mental functioning. So these are well beyond bone and menstruation. And we also know that there are performance deficits from low energy availability as well. A wonderful study by Van Heest in the U.S. where they took teenage swimmers, did a 400 time trial, 400-meter time trial freestyle, and then these athletes all had the same training program. At the end of the training program, they repeated their time trial. Mm-hmm. And what was just fascinating in this study is that there were two groups of women. Really, they all had the same training, but there was half of the women had ovarian suppression from low energy availability, and the other half had normal functioning ovaries with regular menstruation. The athletes with regular menstruation and healthy ovaries, a healthy system, got faster. Well, you'd expect that. You go through a training block, you do a pre-training block, time trial, a post-training block, and they got faster. Significantly faster, which is what you hope to have happen when you work hard at the swimming pool. the women that had ovarian suppression actually got slower in their post-training time trial than their pre-training trial. So the difference between the two groups was quite profound. And this just shows that the response to training stimulus is blunted by low energy availability. Now, there are other studies as well that support this premise beyond that one, but that was probably the most pivotal one by Van Heest.
Right. I mean,
so what works for coaches and for athletes, if I say, look, do you want to be better? Do you want to be faster? Do you want to perform better? I mean, most athletes will say yes, and so will coaches. And I say, well, listen, we can make you better, faster, stronger, if we can tweak your energy status to match your energy output, and then we'll make you faster.
Right.
We'll make you less likely to be injured and less likely to be ill because your immune function will be healthier and your risk of injury will be less. Right. So the performance piece is really important to engage the athlete in the treatment process, or prevention.
Right, and it really sounds to me like it's an integrated approach with nutrition and fueling and the training aspects all intertwined together to get a good result versus just worrying about a weight number and so on.
Absolutely. Actually, I don't really pay much attention to weight numbers per se. We use more sensitive markers like hematological markers. We use body composition and whatnot, as well as training performance parameters to monitor how these athletes are doing. But you're absolutely right. It is an integrated team approach to both prevention and treatment. I work very closely with a registered dietitian. I work very closely on my team with a sport physiologist. We have also a mental health worker, a psychiatrist that works with us, and the coach.
Right.
The coach is a very integral part because if the coach doesn't buy into the prevention and treatment, and when I say we really need to decrease this person's energy output, we need to decrease their mileage or decrease their training load because we're not able to keep up with the nutritional changes, I need that coach on board.
Yeah.
To support this. And so that it really is a multidisciplinary team approach or interdisciplinary team approach in the treatment and prevention of this problem.
One question about amenorrhea. Now, how uncommon is it for a woman to, let's say an elite runner who's, they usually train to be very, very lean. How uncommon is it for them to lose their period? If they were to train over a macro cycle, let's say a year, or maybe even a year and a half, is it really uncommon for them
to lose their menstruation?
Yeah, for even a short time, for even a month or something.
Yeah. No, it's not uncommon. And in fact, when we cycle someone, I'll kind of say, when we alter their body composition to decrease their mass so that they can run faster, because there is a sweet spot where they will run faster when their mass is lower. We may have the athlete miss 1 or 2 periods, but for a short period of time under very controlled circumstances, I'm not too worried. There's ways to bring the athlete down to the appropriate body composition for speed in a healthy way, and then there's unhealthy ways to bring them down.
Right.
And so if I need to maximize someone's body composition for the Olympic Games or World Championships or elite performance, we can do that. We can do that in a healthy, safe way that minimizes the negative impact on their health. And really at that level of sport, we're walking a fine line between ideal optimum performance and risk of health complications through injury and other things. So it is being able to know what individualized program for that athlete, what their limits are, how far we can push them, and where's the sweet spot for their ideal body composition for performance.
Yeah, and that sweet spot is probably going to be a range versus a one number.
It's definitely a range. It's not a number, it's a range, and it's taking into account all of the parameters. And I like to try and keep them menstruating all year long, but maybe occasionally certainly at the certain peak times where we have that, but we try to minimize that. That's why I really don't want them on the birth control pill, because I can't tell. The birth control makes them have, what we call false periods or has withdrawal bleeds, and we can't actually tell whether they're in trouble from their body shutting down.
How do you navigate that? So I work with female athletes often, and they'll tell me, well, I have an IUD.
For birth control.
They have IUD. So how do you navigate that to make sure that they're not seeing red S symptoms when...
Right. Well, I use a non-hormonal IUD often in these athletes. It's called, copper T. It's not a new form of birth control. It's a very old one. That one does not interfere with hormonal function. Now, there's IUDs with a hormone on them, which does interfere with the ability of the hormonal system to function. I mean, that's how they work. Right. That's how the birth control pill, and that's how these things work, by interfering with the normal hormonal function to suppress ovulation and implantation. So that's why they work so very well.
Right.
However, in these situations where I'm trying to monitor the body's function, where I need to know whether their body's shutting down their hormonal function, I don't want any external hormones interfering with that very clear marker of health, which is regular menstruation. So the copper IUD does not interfere with that, but still provides them with adequate and appropriate birth control, and safe birth control. We do know that the birth control pill can have a negative effect also on bone health. So we try to not have athletes on that, especially athletes that have impact and endurance, to decrease the risk of bone stress injury.
Mm-hmm. And is that for the same reason, say, that someone who's menopausal, a woman who's menopausal, will often be susceptible to osteoporosis, and it's an estrogen issue there? Is that the reason?
Yeah, so it's not so much energy availability in most postmenopausal women, it's estrogen availability. Right. So we know the younger female athlete, their bones can be negatively affected by the lack of estrogen. Mm-hmm. But independent of estrogen, you can have negative bone effects from low energy availability. Right. So it's not only related to estrogen, and in men, we know the same thing, that men with low testosterone, so older men, can get osteoporosis as well. Right. Young men with low testosterone can have negative bone effects, but irrespective of testosterone, low energy availability can cause thinning of the bones in men. So there's independent pathways outside of these sex hormones that negatively affect bone health.
I see. Now, you mentioned men. How would a male athlete see signals of red S? Or how would a coach see that?
So if we're going to start with the sex hormone, young men should have a very healthy sex drive. And what I often find in my elite endurance athletes is they say, well, I don't really have the sex drive I used to have. And one very clear marker is all of the young men should wake up with a morning erection. And this was a simple question. Are you having morning erections or not? Do you have the same sex drive that you used to have? I had an athlete come into me after I reversed his energy deficiency. It took me about a year to do this. He came into me one day. I'd measured his blood. And he said, you don't need to tell me what my testosterone is. And I said, oh, really? He said, nope, it's good. I know. I'm in a class and all of them are women but me, and I didn't notice it till the end of the term that I noticed today. So those are two, just speaking only of sex hormones. There's other markers, repetitive illnesses, viral infections, things like that, GI dysfunction, mental irritability or feeling like they're not recovering, sleep disturbances, poor performance, not feeling like they're really, they often say to me, I just don't have enough fuel in the tank, just really not getting the performance outcome that I want for the amount of energy I'm putting into it or the training that I'm doing. Obviously, anyone with a bony stress injury is a big red flag for me to investigate their energy availability.
Right. I see.
So there's some markers. I mean, women have a very obvious one with lack of menstruation or oligo or amenorrhea, which is changes in the menstrual cycle. Amenorrhea is lack of menstruation. So those are very easy ones for women to spot. But the men do have signs that they can monitor for as well.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and it makes sense because if there's low energy availability, then they're just not going to perform well in the workouts. They're going to feel sluggish. They're going to feel like they can't maintain the paces. And so if you're trying to increase a power to weight ratio, you can't do it without the numerator, right? You have to really work hard on
Yeah.
So that's a good sign if they're just starting. Maybe they're not hitting the workout requirements.
Yeah, and athletes know.
Yep.
I monitor their response to, after training. What was your workout like today? What was your recovery like today? How'd you sleep? Next day, we have a system to monitor how they're feeling and how they assess, and then the coaches as well know how they're performing and what's coming out of their practices and performances.
I see. Now, so I've read about your return to play process with the athletes that you work with. Now, I thought this would be very interesting for coaches, and perhaps there may be some elements of the return to play process that coaches can sort of borrow from. So can you talk about that for our listeners? What is the return to play process when you see athletes, male or female, having some RED-S symptoms?
Well, the first thing we do, thank you for raising this, is a very important part. It's one thing to say, here's the problem, but then what do we do about it? So this is really part of the second, this return to play paper that we published is really part of the second of issue, which is now what do we do about it? So the first thing we do is risk stratify the athlete into saying, okay, how big a problem is this? Are they, perfectly functioning in all areas where we can just say, carry on and perform? Or are they seriously unwell where we need to say, look, it's unsafe and unhealthy for them to participate in sport right now, where it could be quite significantly detrimental to their health, where we actually need to stop them from play until we can get them emergent care. And thankfully, very few athletes are categorized into that category. Then there's the middle category, or the yellow. We have red, yellow, and green for green go, red stop, and yellow caution. So most athletes that I treat are in the yellow, where they can participate in sport but need to be treated so that we're preventing the problem. So these might be athletes with some menstruation problems, some bone problems, or any of those systems that we discussed. So if they're in that yellow zone where we've risk stratified them, what we can do is then implement some interventions to help them. So we can get them dietary help, we can get them mental health help, we can maybe decrease their energy output by having some coaching intervention. There's actions. So I individualize the treatment plan for each athlete, because each athlete's story will be a little different. Some may have some energy restriction because they have gluten intolerance, or they are, vegetarian, vegan. For various reasons they have energy restrictions. And maybe some of them are students living away from home, and they just don't have access to food. I have some athletes that just have food insecurity, is what we call it. And so then the treatment then will be absolutely targeted to each person's experience. Then when we've undergone a little bit of 2 or 3 months of treatment plan, we reevaluate the markers that we're looking for, such as blood parameters, performance parameters, symptom parameters. And then when we return them, we can move them from the red zone into the yellow zone and say, okay, you can start back to training, but we're going to put you to decrease training load until we can ensure that when we increase your energy output, that you're increasing your energy intake, and that your body's equilibrating these energy changes, and then gradually increase their energy output as they monitor their intake and match it accordingly. So it's a process by which the athlete, coach, the sport physiologist, and we all work together to make sure that we return them to play after taking into consideration their health and sport parameters. So is this, what is their high-risk sport, low-risk sport? What time of year is it in their sport? Are we just a month out of the Olympic Games and just need to get them through? Or do we have time to spend a little bit more time adjusting things? So there's all these parameters that we take into consideration when returning them to play.
I see. Yeah, and I think there's a lot, if you're a coach, even if you're not coaching elite athletes, most of the time most of the athletes that we coach are recreational fitness athletes, weekend warrior types. I think the message probably there is to seek help from qualified medical professionals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Go speak to your family doctor, and if your family doctor has not heard of REDS, please give them the link to the papers.
Right.
It is certainly being taught in medical schools now, but certainly when I went through medical school, obviously it was not being taught because it just came out in 2014. So please seek medical help. Your physician should be familiar with REDS. If they're not, you can show them the link and then they can assist and help, because there's other things that can cause amenorrhea. Pregnancy is one of them. Certainly you can have other female issues that affect menstruation other than REDS. So it's important that a physician does a proper assessment to make sure there's not other causes of the amenorrhea or the thin bones. And then once those other causes are ruled out, the chances are it's related to the energy availability.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll definitely, the links from your IOC paper and some of the other links from the return to play model that you have out there, I'll put those in the show notes. And until then, we're going to watch this issue very closely. Do you have any other final words or advice for athletes and coaches on this subject?
I do have one, and actually I think it's a fairly important one to end with. Sport is a very healthy thing to do. We know that people who engage in sport and participate in sport have less mental health problems, they have better health outcomes, they have healthier pregnancies, so they have longer lives and healthier lives. So, it's really important that people remain active and become active and not be frightened of physical activity, because it really is life-saving to be physically active, with decreasing all kinds of non-communicable diseases and other health problems. So please don't be frightened to exercise, but please be sensible about your exercise. Make sure that you're fueling your sport appropriately. Food is fuel, and sport needs fuel. And if you have any of those symptoms on that hub and spoke diagram that's in the papers that you're concerned about, please seek help. Please seek it early. And, of course, to all coaches, please respect your athletes as human beings and refrain from erroneous coaching practices that can either overtrain them or through body shaming or unhealthy practices to decrease body compositions that may be beyond what's physically feasible for that particular individual.
Perfect. That's very helpful. Very, very important topic. So thank you for your time. And do you have a social media presence where people can follow you?
Sure. My Twitter is at Margo.Mountjoy, and I'm also on Facebook, so I'd be very happy to have people follow me if they wish. Perfect.
Well, Dr. Mountjoy, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Tony, and I appreciate your attention to this important health matter for our athletes.
Thank you again to Dr. Mountjoy for having that conversation with me. And I look forward to reading up on all of the follow-up work that she and her team will be releasing in the coming months on this topic. So I just wanted to underscore some of the important lessons from the podcast and the fallout of the Nike Oregon project and some key takeaways before finishing up. And I want this to be a sort of evergreen teaching moment that will age well and be a resource for athletes and coaches. While it's certainly true that power to weight ratio is a significant factor in activities of self-propelled motion, swimming, cycling, running, rowing, etc., just simply focusing on an arbitrary weight goal, that's an incorrect and really a lazy way to execute training. And as you've heard, there are performance and potentially health ramifications that can result from such a simplistic approach. The Nike Oregon project fallout just demonstrates that coaches on the highest level often get this wrong. And for athletes looking to meet or exceed the demands of races, that's what it's really all about. Whether you fall on the spectrum of recreational to professional, understand that there are reputable and science and evidence-based approaches that can be employed by qualified coaches and personnel. I spent years working with professionals, doctors, PhDs, master coaches, etc., to try to determine the best way to do this the right way. And as we touched on in the podcast, for those athletes that are training for high performance, where that's a goal, you have to think of competition-ready body composition as a range versus some perceived silver bullet weight number to hit. That's not the right way to do it. And male or female athletes looking to work with coaches, an important thing to look at is what's their onboarding process like? Do they have a robust questionnaire process and a contract process as a part of that onboarding process? And part of that contract should be clauses on confidentiality. In a coach-athlete relationship, a coach may get to know personal information about an athlete, but there's a responsibility on that coach of confidentiality. That should be contractual. No coach should ever reveal personal details about athletes to other athletes, and certainly not in front of other athletes. That's madness. So, of course, the coach-athlete relationship needs to be built on trust and empathy, and needs to be a two-way street. None of this my way or the highway drill sergeant like tactics. They don't work. And so coaches are paid to get results, but not at the expense of the athlete's physical and mental health. So you're looking for coaching platforms that have robust support, have built out robust platforms with robust support. Your coaches should have a broad range of nationally recognized certifications that require CEUs. And, I recommend any coach that works with us to have a internationally recognized sports nutrition certification. But more importantly, the coaching staff should have the options to contract out with medical professionals, doctors, psychologists, nutrition professionals, whenever they need them, to contract out other services, or just have insight, get insight to build out smart thought leadership on all aspects of training and coaching. Also, does the coaching staff have women on it? Are they trained in women's physiology? Do they even have those conversations about menstruation within the training cycle? Are they trained in familiarity with eating disorder risk factors? These are all questions that you should ask. So I will have a follow-up podcast on this topic at some point, just because I think it's important and there's more we can talk about and unpack. In the interim, though, I want the listeners to do two things. First, share this podcast. Share it with your Twitter followers. Share it with your weekend warrior, swim, bike, run, triathlon, Facebook groups. Share it with all of your social media platforms, because I think it's important to spread awareness around the issue, and the more we do that, the more we can influence change. The other thing that I want you to do is comment. Comment on the podcast thread, and you can go to eventhorizon.tv/podcasts, and you can see there how to join the podcast community, whether it be our private Facebook group, or you can comment there, or you can comment on the blog, podcast thread on the blog, or you can send in an anonymous comment to contact@eventhorizon.tv. I especially want to hear from our listeners that are female athletes. What were your thoughts about this podcast? What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Do you have any personal accounts of, working with coaches on training? And what were your thoughts about the fallout of the Nike Oregon project? I want to hear it all. So, until next time, this is the Endurance Experience Podcast.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.